Hey guys, welcome to my How to EQ Everything series, and today we have bass. Let's do it. Okay, so the bass guitar is of course the foundation for every song. It is where all the weight, all the body comes from. So without the bass, there is not much going on in any song. Without bass, actually, songs would sound pretty flat and pretty boring, especially a pop song. Can you imagine like a pop, hip-hop song without bass? No. Even rock? No way. So we need to make sure that we have a solid bass, a solid foundation going on with this one instrument only. And it also has a responsibility for supplementing low end to other instruments that might be missing it. Because of course, in the mix, you add everything together. So even electric guitars, distorted electric guitars, will sound bigger if they're supplemented by a nice strong bass guitar. And I even EQ guitars and bass guitars together sometimes to make sure that they work together in unison to get this big wall of sound. We'll have a look at a few different basses here, even electronic ones. Let's have a look at number one here. Okay, so this is quite a typical recording. It is actually very good. There is not much wrong with it. What you'll notice with pretty much every bass recordings is that you will have, just like in pretty much every other instrument, the usual 200 to 500 excess that we don't like, and sometimes also a bit of a lack of presence. Now that, of course, depends on what kind of bass you want. There are the rounded bass guitars that only supplement the low end and maybe a little bit of the lower mids. Then there are the really gritty ones, which we'll also do one later for rock and metal and everything in between. So let's have a look at what we can do to this particular bass guitar. So in this particular bass, I found that there were two issues. There is the mud around, or exactly at 200, and there's this little resonance going on, which is probably from the body of the instrument itself, around 500, 450. And this particular one, it's neither body, which is in the lows down here, and it's also neither presence, which is above that range. So we can safely remove it quite a bit, quite aggressively, to get more of the rest. Because especially after compression, what would happen is that this resonance will become louder. And then as you play the song, you don't know why you have this weird 500 hertz thing going on. And it's actually from the bass guitar. And this happens a lot, that you end up finding these little resonances in other instruments as well. Just to be safe, I also add the low cut, but of course you want to preserve the foundation. So I'm just going to do a security kind of safety rumble cut here at 20. Okay, so we did a really good job cleaning up this bass guitar sound. And in terms of fixing, this is, I believe, all that has to be done. Now, what I would normally do is I would compress it. And I'm going to show you how I do it because it's a big part of the context as well. So I usually use an LA2A 1176 kind of compressor for bass guitars. And I like to go quite aggressive. Now, the LA2A, it doesn't recover to zero quite as quickly, so you can be a bit more aggressive, and it's okay if the compressor doesn't recover, it's fine. What I'm doing here is I want to make sure now that every note is even in the performance. So I can be quite aggressive, and then what I can do is then I can actually change the tonality of it a little bit. So now I can decide what kind of presence I want on my bass guitar. So for me, really, there are three ranges in bass guitar that are important. There is one around 800 to 1K, which is kind of the honky, kind of more old school rock kind of tone, and I'm going to show you exactly what that sounds like. So this is what you hear a lot in certain rock songs, you know, this kind of low end, low mid, grunty kind of attack on the bass. It's around this area, usually 800-ish. And for me, it is very important that I do this boost after the compression. And the reason for it is because the compression evens out the notes, and then when I do a boost like this, the boost will also be more even. Now, if I did it the other way around and I boosted before, then what I would get is I would probably end up boosting the higher notes in volume as well, and therefore I would have a less regular or a more jerky compressor movement. I would get more uneven compression. So first I like to make sure that I remove any problems from my sound sources, from my instruments. Then I do my compression, and then I can do on top of that the tonal shaping of the instrument. Now the second range is about an octave above, around 1.6. And here we are getting into a bit more gritty territory. So this is very cool for different kinds of pop, more aggressive rock songs and so on, when you want a bit more of the scratchy tone of your bass guitar, but still with a bit of the grunty sound. But you can also go higher, and this is where kind of the rocky, metal-y bass guitars live. Or if the recording allows, of course, you can go even higher and get that kind of Korn, really aggressive bass guitar sound. Now, the reality is that usually the recording and of course the context will dictate what you have to do. I remember in this mix what I did a little bit of 3.2 and a little bit of 1.6 to get best of both worlds, to get a bit of the scratch, a bit of the pick on the string, and a bit of the kind of body grunty tone. And this is a sound that will cut through extremely well. Now what I can also do is I can boost the low end. And I also do that, of course, after compression, because first, as I said, I want to even out the performance, I want to even out the notes, and then I can have a more even boost of low end. And for that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to boost lower than what I actually want to boost, because of course these EQs have a very strong curve, and I'm going to show that to you visually as well. I'm going to open up another instance of the Infinity EQ. So let's say if I want to have more 50 to 100, I'm going to have to set the frequency a little bit lower so I don't end up boosting too much of the 200 as well. And of course, all of these boosts, I just use this EQ because this is my default EQ when I EQ basses, but of course you can achieve the exact same results with any kind of bell EQ. So you have your grunt here, your more growly mid-range up there, and a nice pick attack up here around 3-4K. Let's have a look at the next bass. Okay, I remember this was from a new metal song, so this is a very aggressive tone. You can hear it's a very low pitch as well, it's tuned very low. And here we definitely want to have a lot of the scratchy kind of upper mid-range, and we want to have a very solid low end that will carry the song. So this is actually the kind of EQ I would use here. I would do a lot of reduction in the range that we don't need at all, because here we'll have very heavy guitars coming in, we have heavy drums in this mix as well, so we want to remove everything that we don't absolutely need. So you can see I'm quite aggressive with my EQ here in the lower mid-range, and then I can set the tone again like previously with boosts on the left and the right of it, so in the upper mid-range and in the lows. And you might ask now, okay, but how is this going to work with the kick? So here's the secret. If you have cleaned up your kick with the same kind of low mid EQ in the right spaces, and you've cleaned up your bass as well, then they're going to work together. If it's a somewhat well-produced song, if there's some thought that has gone into the production itself and the recording, then these moves will usually be enough. Also, let's not forget that the kick is a momentary impact, whereas a bass is kind of a long sausage that just goes throughout the whole song. So the momentary impact will always be recognizable to our ears. So if they are clean, then they work. So I don't understand this big issue of separating the kick and the bass, because it just happens naturally if you have cleaned it up enough. Given that the recording is at least somewhat good, okay? If it's if it's a really bad recording, bad production ideas, bad production choices, bad instrument choices, and so on and so forth, then of course we have issues. But usually this is the kind of EQ I would do, and the kick would also work quite nicely, because the kick will have the punch right around here, 80 to 100, and here the lows of the bass are much, much, much lower anyway. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to show you also with compression. And here I'm going to use something a bit more aggressive. Now, what I hear is that scratchy sound is a bit too concentrated. It's a very pointy sound, exactly around 3K. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a very narrow nudge or notch before the compressor, so that after I can make a broader boost around it. So this is a much more pleasant sound now as it is. And to be honest, this is it. This is how I remember mixing this bass anyway. Maybe we can add a bit more of the 1.6 to get even more presence, but otherwise this is enough. Let's have a look at the next one. Okay, so this is an example of a not really well recorded bass. So we don't have a lot of low end going on. We can see that there's a focus here around 100, not a lot of subs to actually carry the mix or carry the song. And there's a big mess here, a big mud in the mid-range, and there's not a lot of presence, which is quite complicated to work with. So this is not ideal. It's not a very even performance. The sound, it's kind of like the notes are blending into each other. It's not very clean. It's not a very clean and clear sound. It almost sounds like it's coming from behind the blanket, or there's some reverb on it, but that's just the fact that it's not a very clean, clear recording. There's probably phasing issues going on. Maybe the cables weren't of high enough quality. The conversion from analog to digital might not have been the best, and so on. There can be an infinite amount of circumstances compromising a recording like this. But nevertheless, this has become a bit cleaner. It's not perfect, but we always have to work with what we are given, unfortunately, especially if you're mixing. Now, if you're producing, of course, then you should make sure that you get everything to the higher standard before even touching a fader or any EQ especially. So let's see if we can save this with a bit of compression and some more EQ. Yeah, so you can hear that even some of the notes, they have more of that attack, and it's not actual real attack. I think that's just a string slapping on the fretboard because it's not played in a very even way. So in some notes we don't have any attack at all that would normally come from a pick, and in some notes we have some rattle that comes from the string touching the fretboard a bit too much, or maybe even the pickup. So this would require major surgery. This would probably require multiband EQ to get rid of those small notes. I actually remember talking with the client that he wants these noises removed, and yes, you know, it's just unfortunate that they are there. So this is what we can do with this kind of bass. It doesn't always happen that you get great recordings, but you have to do the best what you can. Let's have a look at the next. Now, this is a great example of production gone wrong, because I remember talking to the client and the client telling me, hey, where is the low end? I want more low end. And I had to tell them that there is no low end because the bass is simply played in the wrong octave. It wasn't supplemented by a synth bass, there was no other bass instrument. On the analyzer, it might seem like there's a lot of low end, but there isn't actually. So this is where you have to do some trickery again. But again, I think this is a production choice that wasn't very successful. So we have to be really aggressive here with EQ, unfortunately. I remember this didn't even work that well in the context of the song. The main presence of the sound here is around 500-600 Hertz. It has that knocky, grunty mid-range that is actually in the way of many other of the instruments. And then the low mids are just too much, but there's not significant or not substantial low end to actually give a bass to the song itself. And here we definitely don't want a lot of the scratchy top end, so I'm not even going to attempt doing any boosting there. So yeah, this is some. So yeah, this is also a problematic one that we have to work with. And you can clearly hear how the bass guitarist moves up on the fretboard, that the lows disappear. But when the bass guitarist returns to the lower notes, then there is this big boom. And unfortunately, this is a playing, this is a production, a composition mistake, because of course, if you play very high notes, then you will have no low end. Some really high quality bass guitars will retain the low end even up to maybe the second octave, maybe even the third, but definitely no higher than that. But that requires excellent bass guitar, excellent playing, an excellent amplifier, and cables and microphones and so on. Let's see what we can do here with a bit of compression, or a bit more if we can even it out. So it doesn't help too much. It's a bit more even, at least in terms of performance, but the low-end body is still not there. I think what I ended up doing here is actually pitching down this bass guitar by 1 octave, cutting all the treble off, and then mixing in that freshly gained low end. Let's have a look at the next one. Okay, this is very similar to one of the previous ones, so just quickly. So this one just had the kind of lower mid-range issue. But this also has another problem, that it doesn't have a lot of low end below 100 or 50 Hertz maybe. But that's not too bad, because a harmonizer, a low end synth sub, something like that can replace that or generate that low end quite well. Let's have a look at another one. Now here we have exactly the inverse problem. Here we have too much low end but no presence whatsoever. So this bass is going to be really hard to mix in a way where you can hear every note. So this is more of a supplementary bass. I can't remember if it was intended like that in the production, but there is no presence actually to begin with in the recording here. It almost sounds like a collection of room modes of just boom, you know, of standing waves, but it doesn't sound like a clean bass guitar like we heard on some of the first ones. Okay, so there is some presence, but we have to boost like a ridiculous 14 dBs, so that's quite extreme. What I don't like about this bass guitar is that it has just this muddy kind of sound. It sounds like a resonance almost. It doesn't sound like clean notes, it just sounds like boo, boo. It's really hard to describe. But again, this is something you have to work with. And you can even see in the waveform that the note that is being played, the foundation, the fundamental note is disproportionately loud relative to any of the other harmonics. So of course it sounds more like a standing wave than kind of an integrated bass guitar sound with beautiful harmonic content. Okay, so now let's have a look at an upright bass guitar. Okay, so it sounds quite nice. It looks pretty good. You can see that the lows, the body is actually retained on the upper notes as well. It's quite an even sound. It's quite a good recording. I remember being able to mix this quite well into the song. We have good presence, although a bit too quiet, but at the same time in this kind of song we might not need too much of the slap up top. So let's see if we can clean it up and even it out a little bit. Okay, so it's a bit too aggressive with this compressor, so I'm just gonna do without it for now. I would need a bit more time to set this up properly. But the sound is there, the sound is pretty good, and we needed very little here actually. And as you can see, I never do the same thing. I might do similar things, but I always go through the same problem reaction solution when I mix. I always try to isolate the problem and then I reduce it in a targeted way. I'm not just randomly boosting and cutting frequencies. So this bass would actually be a really good candidate for multiband compression, where I would treat the lows and the upper mids separately, and that's actually what I remember doing in the mix. I'm not going to do it now, I'm going to do multiband compression in another video, but what I would do is I would make sure that the lows are even and that the highs, the treble, the upper mid-range is slapping nicely on every note. But as you can see, a good recording doesn't need that much work. Now let's have a look at a synth bass. It consists of a sub and a dirty layer on top. Now, this is an excellent production choice and an excellent decision. So they use a separate bass to supply the low end, the body of the sound, and then another one to do the presence. And I think this is great because this makes it easy to mix it as well. And it makes it, and you can be sure that this bass will be heard because the notes will come at the same time and you'll be able to identify that, okay, even though it's two separate sounds, it will still feel like the same instrument. So the sub Moog, I imagine already it's going to look something like 3 or 4 very distinct spikes as the notes are going up and down, and they will move, I'm guessing, somewhere between 50 and 100 hertz. Yeah, what did I tell you? 1, 2, 3, 4 spikes between 50 and 100 for the foundation. For the fundamental, that is. So this is quite typical, and of course, the problem with this is that if you have a room mode, as I have in my room as well, I'm not gonna dare touching anything below 200 on this one. Because if I remove what I feel being muddy right now, which is this one, then I'm basically removing half of the bass. But at the same time, I know this is okay because it is just low end. But we can have a listen if it changes a little bit, if we can clean it up. But I want to be very gentle because I don't want to risk taking out a frequency completely that is a major part of the sound here. So I'm just going to do this and just a security rumble blocker around 20. Personally, I don't like these kind of basses because they're so concentrated around one frequency. So this will sound amazing and heavy on speakers and headphones that have this frequency, this one frequency range between 50 and 100 represented really well. But if you have room modes like most of us do and like I do, this note will basically disappear, which is very unfortunate. So I would much prefer a broader sound like this, like most of the bass guitars were earlier on. Now let's add the top layer as well. Now the great news is that we have different spikes and a much broader sound, a more continuous sound, which actually fills up the gaps of this waveform nicely. I mean, even visually, these analyzers are pretty good. Even visually, we can see how these two sounds complement each other really well. Right, it's almost like we are putting two forks together like this, so they complement each other and they build one big sound. Now on the upper one, there is this rumble here. I want to get rid of that. Even if I cannot hear it, how could I hear 5 hertz or 10 hertz on my speakers in my room? That's virtually impossible. But if you have enough of these across multiple instruments, and that is the case many times, then they will build up. And what they will do is, you might not hear it, but they will force your speakers to move like crazy, and that will impact their behavior and their performance. So it's a very good idea to have a safety low cut across every instrument that you have. And now from this point, together I can almost treat this like a bass guitar. So I can decide which one will be the present frequency that I want to feature most. Is it kind of the 1.6 grunty, growly sound, or a 3.2 attack, like a picky attack? And I can even now clean up the low mids together because they have combined so well together. Well, and I quite like actually adding a really big boost quite high up here. It opens the sound up nicely. So this would definitely cut through, and what I would do next now is I would make sure that the lows are nice and compressed, most likely with a multiband, so that we have an even low end across the song, and then of course automate it from section to section. And then maybe I would even add an upper mid-range expander on the same multiband compressor, but I would set it up as an expander, so on every note the upper mid-range comes up, and that way you get more grit, you get a cleaner attack. I have shown this trick before, and I'll show it again in a future video. Okay, so the next bass is basically the same one, just in the verse, so we can treat it the same way. And it has actually less distortion, but it also has this spike, as you can see, in the very, very lows, so we want to get rid of that, just like this. And you can see that it's also this forky kind of sound, but it doesn't have anything to complement it. So in the verse of this particular song, this is what we had, and this is what I did, just the low end cut, and then just blend it in as needed. Okay, so I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. If you want to learn more, I do one-on-one classes of about 4 to 5 hours each. We can have one session together to fix a specific issue that you have in your mixing, or we can have 3 sessions where we go over the full foundation, all the fundamentals of mixing and mastering and of sound in general. And I believe that by having this foundation, you will be able to stop watching YouTube videos and come to your own conclusions and find your own solutions by yourself. Because it's really all about the foundations, as I always say. It's all about having that basics really baked into your brain so that you don't have to watch any YouTube videos, because you know exactly what is going on at all times. Also, if you want to have anything mixed or mastered, hit me up. My contacts are in the description below. And I will see you in the next video, and until then, happy mixing. Bye bye.